Hi, everyone. Let's start the seminar. So this week, we're really excited to have Kevin Ellis here. So Kevin Ellis did his PhD at MIT, and he's currently assistant professor at Cornell. And he has done a lot of really awesome work in the intersection of program synthesis, AI, and human cognition. And his research has gotten the NSF Career Award, as well as the ARC Prize, and has also been featured in the New York Times and the MIT News. And I'm super excited to hear your talk.
All right. Thank you so much, Elin. Invite. All right. Thank you so much for the invite and the intro. So I'll be talking about mental programs in humans and machines. And to orient ourselves, I want to talk first about an efficiency trade-off that I think AI today has between data efficient learning and learning that is compute efficient at test time. So we all know deep learning, it demands a lot of data, but at test time, you just need a fast forward path. So there is an approach called program synthesis that I'll be talking about, which basically means searching for a discrete program instead of continuous waits in order to fit some data or solve some task. And you can usually do this from very few examples. But what it means in practice is that you're actually doing a discrete search for a new piece of symbolic code every time you want to do something new. So it's very compute efficient. So humans, and I think the future of AI, can often be efficient in both senses. And my view is that they're doing this because reasoning is integrated into the learning algorithm, and this extra compute that happens in the reasoning process is really bridging the gap between the small amount of original data and the downstream path. So if that's what's going on, then the challenge is to understand and engineer specifically inductive reasoning. So to drill down more into this dichotomy between reasoning and learning, these terms are often very overloaded. So I'm going to present just the way that we're going to think about it in this talk. Lots of people have framed it this way also. So I'm going to view in this talk learning as being knowledge that is derived from data, so some kind of statistical estimation, and reasoning is some kind of knowledge that you derive from knowledge through some extra compute you do on top of what you know. So from that perspective, obviously, reasoning is expanding the knowledge you get from a given amount of data. Now, reasoning has a tremendous amount of focus today in AI, and if you look at what's going on with large reasoning models, the general view is that reasoning grows on top of learning. And they've been very successful, and so it makes a lot of sense to follow this paradigm. It's interesting that program synthesis flips this on its head. So when you're searching for a program to explain some data, you're doing search, you're doing reasoning. And so the idea is that learning, in the program synthesis view, actually has as its foundation a reasoning algorithm. So to get these issues, we're going to talk basically about four things today. We're going to start with mental programs that humans can learn and think about how we could computationally model that process. We're then going to talk about some core tech and neuroprogram synthesis, which also tries to get at similar things. And the main reason why we're doing this is because ultimately I want to get to mental programs that describe how things in the world work, different kinds of world models. And those world models, they might be structured as programs, but obviously programs are not the only game in town. So when we're done with that, we're going to revisit this question of whether we should be using symbols or weights. So if we look specifically at just humans and knowledge representation, one classic idea is to have a mental programming language that recursively builds new concepts out of old ones. And I don't want to commit here as to what it is. You can think of it as Python, English, logic, algebra, just some kind of mental language for building up bigger expressions out of smaller ones. Now, when cognitive scientists have thought about what it means to actually do this, they realize, as Liz Belke puts it, that you immediately encounter a big problem. She calls it the curse of a compositional mind. And basically, it's that the combinatorial explosion causes learning to be both underdetermined and also intractable. So to understand this curse, consider learning the expression for Coulomb's law. So you're going to play Coulomb. You're going to look at some experimental data, and you're going to try and come up with the symbolic form of this equation. So this is hard because it means searching the space of all equations, which is discrete and infinite, and only a tiny sliver fits the data. And to make your life worse, that tiny sliver is infinite also. And you need the one that's actually going to generalize. So we want to unpack this into two curses. One is that most things don't work, and the other is too many things. So to get a handle on this, we're going to look at human category learning. And we're going to start with the hypothesis that people are learning a kind of mental algorithm, but they're expressing that mental algorithm in something kind of like natural language. So for example, maybe you're trying to learn a new causal law that predicts when a machine activates. Here, this child is trying to understand what objects on this machine will turn the machine on. This has been extensively studied in children under the guise of Blicket detectors. So this is Blickets. They're for kids. There's also Blickets for grown-ups. It's this board game called Zendo. It's a game that some people find fun. When I bought it for my grad students, they pretended to enjoy it. And the main twist here is that people are not just learning a new rule, but they're also doing experiments where they get to try out building something, and then they get told whether that thing they built conforms to the rule or not. So it's like Blickets, but for grown-ups and with active learning. And we're going to look at both these. So in these setups, the learner observes some data, like that a green cylinder and a red cylinder activate the Blicket machine, but a blue cube and a red cylinder don't. Then they form some hypothesis, like maybe green cylinders activate the machine. So we're going to need some kind of space of hypotheses. And classically, this would be some kind of bespoke formal language. You sit down, you think about what people might be thinking about, and you come up with some logic that characterizes different rules. But whenever you do this, what you find is that you almost always fail to cover all the things that people could learn. So maybe you thought instead that most of the objects had to be cylinders. And probably in just a few seconds on this slide, it's hard to pick it out, but this formal language I wrote down, it's not going to be able to cover that. So what you would then do is you would go back to the drawing board, you patch up your formal language, and you say, all right, now I can express this concept of the majority of the objects being cylinders, but you probably forgot some other concept, like whether the object is hovering. And we know that preschoolers can learn rules like these about hovering objects. So it's just really hard to formalize the set of things people might think about. And so the natural thing to do is to turn to natural language, because that's one of the main ways that we communicate our thoughts. So we're going to do that. Doing so is actually a pretty old idea. It predates large language models. The first example of it that I know of is this work called Latent Language by Jacob Andreas. And what we're going to do is we're going to say that we hypothesize things in natural language, but we're going to also have uncertainty. We're going to have some posterior distribution because from few examples, we're not really going to know what turns on the Blicket machine. And so our algorithm is going to have to do probabilistic inference on natural language strings, conditioned on the data we've seen, and that's a hard computational problem. Bayesian inference in general is just very tough to do. And so to make inference tractable, we're going to combine a heuristic bottom-up process with a systematic top-down process. And they're going to work together to make inference tractable. So the bottom-up process proposes a small pool of candidate hypotheses, and it gets to look at the data. Think of these as like guesses as to what the rule is. And if some of those guesses are wrong, that's okay because the top-down process is going to reweigh them by a prior and a likelihood. The bottom-up process is just prompting an LLM, and the top-down process is a probabilistic graphical model, a Bayes net, with a likelihood and a natural language prior. So the basics of this Bayes net is that there's a natural language string which gave rise to the observed data. And so therefore, the prior is going to be a distribution on natural language string. Any kind of neural language model would make sense as a prior. And if you use a pre-trained autoregressive model, then you're going to automatically assign lower probability to longer strings. And this will implement a kind of Occam's razor, biasing you towards simpler hypotheses. And because it's a neural net, you can use backprop to try and tune that prior to the data that you see. So the way that the bottom-up process enters this picture is as a proposal distribution. And it's really trying to make inference efficient and also informed by the actual data you see. So it's going to be efficient if you assume that these guesses are often but not always correct. You don't need to propose very many of these bottom-up guesses. And for the guesses that are wrong, they're going to be downweighed via the likelihood distribution, which is comparing the language to the data. So we're going to do that here by translating the language into Python. We're going to run the Python code on the data to see if it actually makes the right predictions. I don't think that's really intrinsic to this approach. You could have other likelihood models, but for what I'm going to show you, this really made the most sense.
That's a question.
Yes.
So why is it more natural to find the prior on the natural language sequence rather than the Python code itself?
Oh, good question. So we actually tried both, and this fit the human data a lot better. I think it's because the languages that we actually use are just a little better aligned with like the way we think about things than Python is. But they're both reasonable things to do, and we tried both. Okay, so we're going to apply this to learning logical rules. We're going to take data from Steve Piantadosi and colleagues, and in their human study, people were learning logical rules, for example, from examples. So in propositional logic, there's concepts like bachelor, male, and not married. If you add quantifiers, you get first-order logic. You can talk about things like the valedictorian of a high school, which involves quantifying over students and comparing different features of them. So people weren't actually learning these English concepts, but instead we're learning often isomorphic concepts about sets of colored shapes, and they were learning them from example. So for instance, on the first trial, the participant might be shown these shapes and be told that none of them belong to the concept. On the second trial, you get another set of shapes. Most people probably say, well, I've seen no things labeled as being an example of this concept, so I'm not going to label anything. But then you get told, actually, this thing belongs to the concept. So then on the third trial, you would see these. You probably think to yourself, well, I bet it's green triangles. So you would maybe label that. You get feedback, just repeat. So after you've set up this model and fit a prior to the human data, these are the kind of dynamics that you get. So here's an example of where the model is working quite well. Here the ground truth rule is the largest object as long as it's also blue. And I'm showing trial by trial accuracies for human and the model. But both humans and the model make a diagnostic failure on the last trial. So why is this happening? What people seem to learn, if we translate it into logic, is actually more complicated than the ground truth. But if we express it in language, it's just the largest blue object. And people seem to latch onto this concept that was simpler in English, but more complex in first-order logic. So one parameter of the model that's important is how many sampled hypotheses you propose. Effectively a knob that's controlling how much you reason about each data point, shown on the x-axis. And in general, you fit the human data well by sampling about 50 hypotheses. Now, you're probably not thinking of 50 things when you look at these simple stimuli, but we're trying to model the mean of 20 people. So it's plausible that people are just thinking about a handful. And the reason why we're able to get away with taking relatively few samples is because those samples were good guesses to begin with. They were driven by the data. Our prompt had the data in the first place. You don't have to do that. You could do top-down proposals, which don't look at the data. And that severely degrades model fit, particularly when you don't take very many samples. So using natural language here was also a lot more flexible than hard coding a formal language. So for example, in this human study, they made learning problems by designing a formal language. And then they made a model which used that formal language. This was great for the concepts that they originally had, but there were certain concepts that were not expressible that are pretty natural for people. So some examples here are majority color and minority color. You could learn these concepts from examples pretty quickly. And the model does that too. But if you look at a program synthesizer, which is confined to the original inventory of logical primitives, it's never able to learn it because it's not expressible. despite having a pretty rich set of things built. So of course, you could patch up this formal language, but it just becomes a game of whack-a-mole. Like, it's just very hard to get all the things people might think about. So going back to the curse of compositionality, we have this infinite compositional hypothesis space in language. And to make search efficient, you sample or propose a small finite subset of hypotheses. You still need an inductive bias, and that's going to be a neural net, but you can tune that to the human data. So next, we studied active learning in humans using this Zendo game. So we're adding to the model the ability to propose experiments, and that gives you new data. You get this kind of induction inquiry cycle. So as adults, we do active experimentation where we're trying to learn how to use a new tool or a new web page, or when we're debugging our Wi-Fi. And as kids, there's similar processes in exploratory play or in active inference during early visual learning. Like, kids are just active learning. So going back to these Blicket machines, you see an experiment. Here, these shapes activate the machine. You form hypotheses. Then you get to do your own experiments, and you go back and forth. So obviously, probability is really important here because probability quantifies uncertainty, and the point of experimenting is to reduce your uncertainty. In general, maximizing information gain. But we also need to incrementally revise our beliefs after each experiment. So given our the way that's going to work is with a kind of LLM-guided sequential Monte Carlo. So there's been a lot of works that are doing LLM-guided sequential Monte Carlo. I'm going to explain exactly how it works in this particular. So we have some hypotheses. These represent what we currently believe, but we just did an experiment, and maybe it falsified one of those hypotheses. Like the blue one here, which is the one that we believe the most, had the most sample. So the bottom-up proposal is going to revise them, kind of mutate them. The top-down probabilistic reweighing is going to compare them to the data, and then they're going to be reweighed and resampled just like a particle filter. So formally, we're given hypotheses, which are drawn from our past beliefs, the data up to time t, and we want to sample new hypotheses, drawn from the data up to time t plus 1. So in what's called sequential Monte Carlo, like the classic version, this latent hypothesis is changing over time. We've got like a moving target, and that doesn't really apply here. Here we have a fixed concept we're learning. Sequential Monte Carlo sampling, or SMCS, instead assumes that this latent is constant, and it proposes changes by perturbing each particle independently. But intuitively, when you have different things in your mind, you might sort of take a global view. Think about global perturbation you can make. So in this version here, which is like LLMs plus SMCS, we're going to prompt with all the hypotheses so that our proposal distribution can sort of see everything at once and know what is good and bad. And then those proposals are going to be reweighed and resampled in a way that's similar to a particle filter. So one thing that we wanted to know is whether this model should capture something about the boundedly rational nature of human learners. So we have this reasoning budget, effectively, how many proposals do we take? And as we crank that up, eventually we start to see that our fit to the human data degrades. So people are maybe acting like these approximate Bayesians, but if you become a little bit too rational, eventually you fit the human data well. So another thing that was sort of specific to this Zendo data set was that humans were a lot better when telling when something didn't follow the rule, which means that their accuracy on positive examples was generally, but not always, lower than on the negative examples. And this was true across a bunch of different Zendo rules. So you could ask, if I just prompt a language model to play this rule learning game, does it reproduce this? And the answer is no. In fact, it can even reverse this trend. But when we looked at this model, it basically reproduced this effect. So one way of viewing these models is as a kind of rational analysis of symbolic learning, where we're trying to not hand design a symbolic language. So echoing the bitter lesson of AI, compared to hand designing a formal language, these models generally fit the human data better at much smaller reasoning budgets. So going back to the curse of functionality, you have to do a lot of search through your hypothesis space because it's infinite and combinatorial. And because we're doing bottom-up proposals, you get a much more realistic kind of reasoning budget. So you can basically think of it as generating, between 1,000 and 50 different hypotheses. So as I claim about cognition, I'm really not saying that the language of thought is natural language. Just that maybe it looks a lot like language, which is always part of the philosophical foundation, but was not a big part of the efforts to build versions of the language of thought based on lambda calculus or based on first order logic or things like that. Those actually look a fair amount different from natural language. So to hammer in this point, why are these models human-like? It's really not because using LLMs, and those LLMs are trained on a bunch of human data. I think it's really because they're doing rational inference over expressive, flexible representation that are also compositional. And what the LLMs are doing is they're really just generating a good pool of expressions in that language. They quote unquote just give you that, but actually giving you that is really cool. So, and what I'm going to talk about next, I'm going to pivot now to engineering. And the program synthesis that we'll be discussing is going to build on a lot of the ideas you saw earlier. It's going to be more motivated toward building AI systems that are inspired by human cognition and not so much motivated by trying to automate software engineering. So this is going to mean learning how to code, but it's going to be done in a kind of cumulative, lifelong fashion where there's some interleaving between learning and reasoning, but we're still going to look at some somewhat practical problems. So as an example of one such problem, suppose you're a graphic designer and you want to draw a picture, have it converted into vector graphics code. Maybe you don't know a vector graphics language, and you want the AI system to get all those details right. Or maybe you're an administrator who has a spreadsheet full of times, and you want to reformat those times, but you don't want to write this big block of Python, which is pretty tricky. Instead, you just want to give some examples in your spreadsheet and have it write the code for you. So if you had to solve problems like these, the natural thing to do is to build a big data set and train a neural network. And these are kind of weird problems. So probably you'd make a synthetic data set. So you might start with some human-written program, maybe like a dozen programs, which is kind of the budget that you could reasonably do in an afternoon. You would maybe prompt the large language model to make other versions of programs that are similar. Just in-context learning is kind of remixing the stuff in the prompt. And then when you run this program, you're going to get an image, and you know that this image came from that code. And so now you have a synthetic image with the paired synthetic code, and you can repeat this process lots of times to make a big synthetic training set. And you would just fine-tune your network, look at the picture, and write the code. So the problem with this story is a kind of sim-to-real gap. Namely, these synthetic problems might not look like what you actually remember. So we're going to solve this with a wake-sleep algorithm. And I'll describe that in more detail later. But like the cognitive models I showed earlier, we're going to dispense with hand-designed formal representations. But instead of English, it'll be Python. But it's still a general-purpose language. And in terms of what wake-sleep is doing, it's really going to be adjusting your prior to make better synthetic data in a way that is interleaved with learning and reasoning. So we call this wake-sleep fine-tuning. And the way it starts is with the same synthetic data generation pipeline that we had earlier. So you have some prompt. It's initially human-written, and this gives you a prior over a program you can sample from to make synthetic data during what is called the dream or sleeping phase of wake-sleep. You're going to fine-tune a network on that synthetic data set. And then during waking, you're going to go out and solve real problems. Every time you do so, you get an example of a real problem, how you solved it. And those examples are great for updating your prior, because that's stuff from the real world. It's like what you should actually be solving. And so we update our prior just by adding that back to the problem. So this is wake-sleep fine-tuning. There's one good thing about it, one bad thing. So the good thing is that learning the prior is very data efficient. It's just adding to a prompt. You can learn it from 10 to 100 examples. which is different from classic wake sleep, which still needs lots of data. But the downside here, and the problem classic wake sleep does not have, is that you need to warm start this with a good prior or a good prompt because everything is discrete. And so you're not able to get any kind of learning signal if you can't at least start solving some of the real. So for example, here we gave it a kind of bad prior towards short program. So after the first sleep cycle, it can solve some new problems during waking, but not very many. But the problems it solved then shift its prior. So over several wake sleep cycles, it can kind of boost. So again, we're doing this partly as a kind of domain adaptation, but also to connect to models of how biological intelligence would learn to be Bayesian, which is what wake sleep was originally in many ways about. So specifically, I want to view this as a kind of lifelong meta-learning, where you're reasoning during waking and then learning during sleeping, and your priors come from tens to hundreds of examples. And this is complementary to models in the past few years that are about also kind of learning to be Bayesian via meta-learning, but where they take a more mammal-style approach. And it's often framed as learning to reason probabilistically, but over evolutionary timescales, so a lot less reasoning, but a lot more data. Back to the actual problems we're solving. We apply this to a variety of programming domains shown here. And to start, you might think that LLMs wouldn't be good at this because their pre-training tends to look kind of like this, where a natural language comment comes before the Python code. They have a good mapping from English to Python. But most of us don't write code like this, where we give input-output examples of a block of code, and then we have the block of code. But that's effectively what we're trying to learn how to do. So recent papers in literature basically said, pre-trained LLMs are not so great at learning programs from examples, from data, both in this paper from DeepMind, and also in this paper that was led by Josh Rule, and that I also helped out with a little bit. So here, both they were saying, pre-trained LLMs are not going to be so great at this. Here we were basically saying, yeah, we found the same thing. And that is true, but after you do this wake sleep fine-tuning, it actually becomes quite good at some reasonably challenging program learning problem. And in terms of the reasoning budget, you need maybe around 1 to 200 samples to do this. So it's not like a single proposal, but it's not like millions of proposals. But again, the caveat is you need to be able to check if those proposals actually match the data. So for example, if you just doodle this picture and throw it at our system, you get these kinds of samples. And one of those samples does look kind of right, but you would need some way of comparing that hand drawing to this vector graphics output. And that in and of itself is a tough problem. So now we're solving these problems in Python, which is pretty different from the long tradition of using domain-specific languages designed for specific classes of problems. So the first commercial success of program synthesis was learning these spreadsheet editing macros, and its domain-specific language, shown here, knew about stuff like regular expressions, concatenating strings, but it didn't have recursion. So what you find when you design these languages is you inevitably end up missing computations that you just wish you could learn, and which are always representable in Turing-complete languages like Python. So for example, this domain-specific language here can't actually learn this time reformatting problem, but it's pretty easy to express using Python plus standard Python library. And this is the same point that I was making earlier. When you design bespoke formal languages, it usually ends up missing concepts that are natural for humans. So is there a future for domain-specific languages? I think for everyday programming and everyday cognition, not really. You really want the breadth of general purpose languages like Python and English. But there's some complexities to this story, and I think that they really do have a future in a different spot. So if you want to make genuinely new discoveries, discover brand new algorithms, then these domain-specific languages are valuable because a new discovery realistically comes from both the human and the machine. And the language that you give to the machine is a valuable way of giving it hints about how to solve the problem. Yeah.
So, I guess I'm wondering what is in the scope of domain languages. Like, for example, I'm assuming that a lot of the Python code that's generated use libraries, right?
Right.
So there's some domain specific in the design of the library. You could think about that. You know, like in the drawing library, there's a lot of domains there, right?
Right. So I would distinguish between domain-specific libraries and domain-specific languages. Domain-specific libraries are great, but when people design domain-specific languages, they almost always make it not Turing complete, and they exclude, most complicated.
I guess I'm just wondering about this dichotomy, right? Because yes, Python is domain general, but to have the right kind of inductive biases to generate a particular, like a vector graphics program, I think if you just started with like base Python, didn't have any libraries, you'd have a lot of trouble.
You would. So like, there's definitely more complexities to this story, but there is something special about being general purpose, which is, in principle, you could express solutions to those vector graphic problems, even without the library functions. Whereas if your DSL can't express something, you're just out of luck forever. But what's good about DSLs is they help you discover new things. So there's a story to go with this, which is after DeepMinds did their competition programming system, where they surprised everyone by synthesizing programs in Python and topping leaderboards in competition programming, they then decided they wanted to discover a brand new algorithm, and they stopped doing Python. So they went back to domain-specific languages. Now, the story is more complicated because they're now showing they can do many of the same tricks in Python. So it's not quite this simple, but I still like this anecdote. There's a value in DSL. All right. So next, we're going to talk about AI systems, which are trying to learn programs that describe the rules behind how things work in the world. These are commonly called world models. They're like mental simulators for reasoning about the future, present, and past. And to be concrete, most of you don't know how to use a tractor because you're not farmers. But if I put you down in front of one, you could probably experiment with this tractor and learn the high-level ideas and answer questions like, what does this button do? And what does this dial measure? And what's in your head after experimenting with this tractor, I'm going to call your world model of this tractor. So you're not farmers, probably, but many of you are academic scientists, which means that you have to deal with complicated digital mechanisms, which are often just as hard to figure out, like very complicated web pages. And you have to do the same kind of exercise. And it's also very high stakes. And as you click around and try things, you're building a mental model. So this is also something that kids do in the lab and at home. It's something that we do when we debug our Wi-Fi or when we tweak our recipe. We're trying stuff out, figuring out how new parts of the world work. And in all these cases, your world model is not this pre-trained artifact you download from Hugging Face. It's something that's rapidly growing and changing as you try out new stuff in the world. So how are we going to build this? So to orient ourselves, Gen AI world models like Genie and Sora and earlier model-based RL, they're learning a pixel-perfect transition function. That's extraordinarily impressive because they have to model things like fine-grained physics, the exact visual texture, how things work. And essentially, they're learning what is the next state, given our current state and action. If you can't see the full state at once, they might model what is the next observation, given the full history of interaction. So there's also a surprisingly old tradition of representing world models as symbolic code instead of neural network weights. And essentially, that means AIs that are programming something like the env step of the environment that you're in. So the nice thing is that code implements systematic algorithm. It tends to extrapolate systematically, but it's also symbolic. So it inherits all the limitations of symbolic AI. But you can learn them from relatively few examples. But that's because you're doing program synthesis, which is computationally expensive. So we're going to talk a bit about how this is good for transfer learning And also point out that obviously programs take symbols in and produce symbols out, but there's ways of getting this to work when you have a more perceptual observation. So our first attempt at doing this was a system called WorldCoder, led by my student Hao Tang. So what WorldCoder does is it learns this transition function represented as Python code. Given this transition function, it's going to act by planning, and it's going to be programming this world model via LLM guided proposals, kind of like the earlier sequential Monte Carlo, but with some technical differences. It's framed more as a bandit problem and less as a Monte Carlo problem. We're going to assume a symbolic deterministic world, and we're going to sweep planning under the rug. We're really just going to focus on model learning and assume that we have the luxury of spending 7 hours solving planning problems. So since learning is program synthesis, you might think it'd be sample efficient. We plop our agent down in this world where it's just trying to use the key to unlock the door, and it spends 1,000 steps learning how to unlock doors. It's not what we want. And obviously, we need good training examples in order to learn our world model. And that means that we need some kind of inductive bias to encourage trying out new things in the world. So we added an inductive bias, which favored optimism in the face of certainty. And when you do that, you learn orders of magnitude faster in practice. You sort of learn to do this task in a more human-like timescale after around 20 or 30 steps. So this works as follows. Suppose you moved around but never touched the key. So one totally OK world model just describes moving around. But another world model also hallucinates that there's some reward for touching the key. It's actually better to hallucinate this fake reward because it causes you to try touching the key, which doesn't actually give you reward, but it gets you to try something new. So formally, we want to fit all the data that we've seen, the data in our replay buffer, but also we want there to exist some kind of plan we can imagine which says that we'll get some kind of reward. So my student analyzed this, and it's still exponential time in the worst case, but it can be exponentially faster than random exploration. So obviously, this is connected to the vast literature on optimism in the face of uncertainty. We're just specializing it to the case of these symbolic world models. So what does it do and not do? So one thing we studied was transfer learning. So the idea is that you are debugging your world model when the world changes and recycling what you used to know earlier. Maybe you first learn to move around and get to goal squares. You encounter a new mechanism in the world, like doors and keys. You recycle your old code that was previously explaining the movement dynamic. And then if you get a new goal, you can zero-shot generalize to it by just reusing the old transition. So one thing it doesn't do is a hard Atari environment like Montezuma's Revenge, which is a kind of challenge task from the deep RL heyday. So it's partially observed. It's just a big, complicated world with physics. It's a pretty hard task. And when deep Q learning first landed, it was actually at the bottom of games that deep Q learning could do, which made it immediately a target for deep RL research. So 7 years later, it was solved in this paper using a variety of tricks. But in deep RL fashion, it still takes billions of time steps. Whereas humans can learn from just minutes or hours, in my view, because they're learning something closer to a mental algorithm describing how the game works. So my student Top developed a program world learner which works in situations like this. And we call it POE world, or product of experts world. It takes a quick human demonstration plus object trackers, and it's learning a model from this demo and then planning using that model. And you're going to see that it's dying. And every time it dies, it's debugging its world model and updating its code. And after a few debugging cycles, it's able to learn how to get to the key. So under the hood, what's happening is we're learning not one big program, but hundreds of little programs, each encoding a different causal law, think different Blicket detectors, which are then aggregated in an energy-based model. So in math, what we were doing previously was learning one really big program that deterministically predicted the next state. And what we're doing now is lots of little programs, each of which is actually stochastic, and we're treating them as probabilistic experts. So for example, suppose you are this character here on a ladder on a platform. You go right, an expert says your x velocity is probably going to be plus. So that's one little program. It kind of slices out this region of state space at the next frame. And another expert says that instead your position might be farther to the right. And this other expert you kind of trust more, got a higher weight. And so it slices out this other region. This pinpoints our x position, but not our y position. So a third expert says, well, in this situation, you're probably not going to change your y position. And together, these three experts are probabilistically predicting the likely next state. So this was super important for learning big and complicated world models. The world coder kind of taps out at a few hundred lines. We really can't scale combinatorial search beyond that. But in this POE world system, each program is really small, so it's much more tractable to find it. And you can learn them independently and scale to world models that have a lot more lines of code for much more complicated world. So by learning these modular experts, you also get a kind of compositional generalization for free. So you can generalize to novel combinations of already learned types of objects. So after you learn how to play Pong, where you have, you're the player, you're trying to play tennis against one enemy with one ball, you can then generalize to Pong with 3 enemies, 3 balls. Or if we have these made up levels in Montezuma's Revenge, we can reuse the experts we had earlier and generalize these other levels. So this is similar to a lot of Yulin Du's work, where he's showing compositional generalization by having these factored representations of the dynamic. So one big technical problem here is partial observability. If I just tell you where everything is and how fast it's moving, it doesn't actually tell you the full state. So you could learn a POMDP, which would introduce a hidden state, Z, and link it up to our observation. And then we'd learn little programs, these experts, that are telling you how that state changes. But this would entangle all of our experts, because they'd all be talking about this kind of moving target, latent state. And that latent state, its representation might change over time as we learn new things. So it destroys modularity. So what we did instead was to represent everything in terms of history. So mathematically, it means we're going to predict the next observation, given the full history of everything we've done. It's going to decompose into a product of these little programs, experts, and each expert gets to look at the full history of everything we've done. So concretely, in Montezuma's Revenge, if you jump from the ground, you kind of go up into the air, you reach some terminal velocity, you drift back down, everything's okay. If you jump off a cliff, you end up dying. So you go up in the air, you reach terminal velocity, you drift down at terminal velocity, and you're less happy. So to do this, you need to remember where you jumped from and how long you've been falling. So what we actually learn as a program is this thing here. And inside that program is this piece of code, which is effectively counting how long you've been falling, according to your history. Now, interestingly, this counter is kind of like a latent state, but we're recomputing it after every single frame. And you could probably post hoc back out a latent state representation by analyzing these programs. But we found in practice, it's a lot easier to go history first. And then if you wanted to, you could try to get a latent state out. But history first worked much better. So the lessons here was modularity for scaling program learning, learning lots of little programs to kind of get around the combinatorial search for a single big program. And this is nice for world models because the world actually is modular. It has independent causal mechanisms. And we'd like to be able to learn them independently and then just combine them together to one world model. So the other thing I really wasn't expecting is that doing things history first is much more tractable. And effectively what it's doing is it's disentangling all these different experts. So next, I'll talk about work that's trying to apply these techniques to robotics, and in particular, when the environment is too detailed to model with symbolic code. So before we get to real robots, we'll talk about simulated robots. So this is work that was led by Yishao Liang, who's a PhD student at Cambridge. So remember, we have these Gen AI world models. They're all about the details. They can simulate everything frame by frame. And they know a ton about the world, but there's some abstract knowledge they might not quite know. So they might not know that going to college helps you get a good job. They might not know that balance beams tell when masses are equal. They might not know these kind of oddball facts, like that trees don't have bones. So I'm going to zoom in on this example here. For a simple simulated robot that's operating this balance beam machine, if it can get equal mass on the two platters, then when it presses the button, it will get reward. So to reason about this and other problems, the system is going to learn a hierarchy of state abstractions, each of which is going to discard information from the perceptual input. So from pixels, there'll be some program which computes if an object is directly on top of another one. It might work by querying a vision language model, and that will bootstrap the learning of higher level abstraction. Now, these abstractions are computed by programs, so they can be recursive, and in fact, some of them are. And full disclosure, we didn't actually learn this first abstraction. We built it in. I think in principle, it could be learned. There's some extra stuff we're learning. So this is just how do we represent the state. We also need to learn how the state changes over time. That's part of the world. So if this robot was instead making coffee, it would need different abstraction, like is it holding a cup or is the cup filled? And so our abstract states would discard the pixel level details and instead replace with binary features like that. So learning these abstract states means synthesizing programs that look at the raw input and then predict these features. Here, using a vision language model to read out properties of the image, similar to Viper GPT. And then there's other programs which are telling you, how does this abstract state change when we intervene and take action in the world? So architecturally, we're going to start with WorldCoder and add a second program, which is going to compute a state abstraction. And we're going to learn it jointly with the transition. We're going to assume pre-trained skills or options. Once we've done this, just to contrast this with the Gen AI world model, we're going to be a lot less precise. We're going to ignore most of the details in the world. But because we're learning programs, we can learn these abstract models from far less data. It's a way of allowing you to sort of quickly build a quick and dirty model of how something new works. And you can learn these abstractions hierarchically because programs can call these. There's a bunch of limitations of this work in particular that frankly made the work much more tractable to do. But I suspect they're not quite intrinsic to this general. OK, so the last thing we did with trying to put this on robots was we teamed up with an actual robotics lab who did most of the actual stuff, particularly Leslie Kelpling's lab, and led by her PhD student, Aidan Curtis. So we want to know, does this work on real robots? And also, we wanted to know, maybe you really like POMDPs, maybe you like latent state. Can we do that instead of history? So here we had a spot robot. Its job was to retrieve apples that were placed in rooms. And critically, in this room, the apple was always here. And in this room, the apple was distributed uniformly across different tables. So POMDPs have a latent state and distributions characterizing how it evolves. And we're going to model these as probabilistic programs and try to learn each of these as Pyro programs in Python. Once you have them, you can then act by solving the POMDP. And we're going to learn it using a probabilistic extension of WorldCoder. But there's this big problem, which is this latent state. And it's just everywhere. Every program talks about latent state. And we never get to observe latent state, not in our data. So we could say, well, let's do history. But we weren't going to do that. So instead, we assumed post hoc observability, meaning after each episode, someone shows you the full trace of hidden state. It's a big assumption. It doesn't work in many situations, doesn't work in Atari, but it actually made sense in this situation because a hidden state was basically what does the room look like. But if you make that assumption, you can learn the following stuff. So from these partial views, plus this post hoc observability, you can learn programs that do things like characterize where the apple tends to be. So the moral of the story is that maybe not everything is symbolic, but you don't have to model everything to have something that is really like a world. How am I for time? Like, should I sort of wrap up and then 3 minutes? Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. So the next thing that we did, I'm going to skip the honor bench stuff. Okay. So so this talk has basically been about symbols. Symbols are great in many ways, but also have their own limitations. So we wanted to do a careful study to know, whether we should actually be using symbols or neural net. And we did so on this benchmark called the abstraction and reasoning corpus, which is the set of grid-based transformation. So you might get an example like this, where you see this beam being shot out that kind of bounces off the wall. You would get a few more examples. And most people, after these examples, if they were to see this input here, could then predict what the right output grid is supposed to look like. Arc is incredibly diverse. There's about 1,000 tasks, lots of different concepts that get engaged. And over the past 5 years, it's had an interesting impact, resulting in a series of competitions. And last Christmas, when OpenAI was doing its 12 days of December releases, on the final day, they announced a new record on Arc. Here's Sam Altman staring at an Arc puzzle. We have never topped the Arc leaderboard, but we learned some fun stuff by working with this data set, and I want to share with you what we learned. So we basically thought of it like this. So given some training examples, we want to make some test prediction of some hidden function. We could do that by inferring a symbolic mental program and then executing it. But we could also just directly train a neural network to solve this problem. We just transduce the output, similar to in-context learning. And you can train neural networks to do either of these. And that's exactly what we're going to do. And we're going to control as much as we can by training on the same corpus of tasks and starting with the same neural network architecture. So the same practice problems, same neural net. Just one is writing code. The other one is producing the answer directly. So we're sort of comparing symbols against neuralese. And when we do this, when we're controlling for everything, what we find is that it's basically a tie. And so immediately you might think, well, that's because there were some easy problems and some hard problems, and they both just solved the easy. So then we made a Venn diagram and realized actually most problems solved by one approach are not solved by the other. This was weird because we were getting this test time dissociation despite a sincere effort to control for all the train time factors that we could. So we built a hybrid model which kind of combined them. It was sort of approximately human level. And to kind of corroborate this, interestingly, if we looked at human data, people spent a bit longer thinking about the more symbolic problems, the one our symbolic system solved, as opposed to the ones that were solved in a single forward by the neural net. So for example, for a symbolic problem, something like this, where you're doing pathfinding through a maze, you get examples of pathfinding, and then your job is to extrapolate to a bigger, harder maze. And program synthesis succeeds here by writing some code. First, it does some chain of thought, and then it basically codes up breadth first serve. Whereas the neural network just produces garbage. But programs are not so great at these more perceptual tasks. This, where you're effectively doing a kind of image denoising. And it's hard to really formalize in Python exactly what the algorithm is. You just kind of see it and get it. Programs are also uniquely suited for composition. So you can compose things very reliably and systematically by writing code. So if we have a test set with less composition, programs should lose their edge. So we looked at a test set that was designed by someone else, had exactly that property. And indeed, there's a important difference between program synthesis and this pure in-context learning. And if you build this hybrid model, the programs really are not contributing. Basically, when you remove composition, you're removing one of the key advantages of program synthesis. So what we learned here is that we have these two approaches. One is where we're generating symbolic hypotheses through inductive reasoning. The other where we're directly transducing the output. Effectively, we're kind of imitating what induction would have done using a neural network. And weirdly, we found they were complementary, even when we tried to control as much as we could for various train time factors. So speculatively, we weren't expecting to see this emerge, but this is it does kind of map neatly onto a system 1, system 2 breakdown. And in fact, there's literature in cognitive science showing that there are types of problems where when you deliberately think about them, it actually impairs performance. With that, I want to thank all the many students and collaborators who are part of this, the subset, and I'll take questions. Thank you. Yes.
I was wondering if you could explain that.
Sure. So, right. So there's a kind of SMC zoo, and the original SMC framework, of which particle filters are an example, is designs where you have this hidden variable, and it's changing over time. So think like tracking the position of an object. So where the object is changing, but it's correlated across time, and it's a probabilistic. You want to do inference in this probabilistic model that is thinking about how it might change over time. SMC tends to just have a nice structure to how it does inference. It's sort of nicely sequential, which makes sense because data kind of streams in over time. And the idea behind SMCS is we want to keep sequential reasoning or sequential inference even when the underlying ground truth is not really changing over time. So the data streams in over time, but the thing we're trying to do inference on, that's actually stationary. So that's the idea behind SMCS. And as soon as you start doing SMCS, where you have a very small set of hypotheses, it becomes convenient to sort of make bigger, more global changes. And from a sort of math point of view, the only twist we're doing to SMCS is saying that the changes we make are conditioned on the full global state. Yes.
How would you scale the product of programming experts? Like, because I imagine that relies heavily on like object recognition or object-centric coordinates.
Right, right. So it's very hard to model low-level physics with Python, even for like these Atari games, and to actually get it right. So in what we're doing now, we're trying to combine it with these abstract world models, which chuck out most of the pixel level details, and then just describe abstract properties like, are you on this platform or that platform? So the model itself actually gets a lot simpler.
Do that now.
Sorry, what?
That's like ongoing work right now.
Right, that's ongoing work, right?
Towards the last part of the talk, where you talked about like the difference between transduction versus induction, what other domains or settings do you think would like more of this like where you have some type of a symbolic program as well as this more like neural network transduction setting? Do you think could be helpful?
Yeah. So world models are one example. So you could have a world model that looks at the current state and then just directly predicts the next state. Or you could have something which kind of projects up to some like more abstract symbolic land and then reasons up there and then maybe goes back down or maybe just stays up here for a while. So I think you see this kind of divide. Yes.
I have a question. So there's a part of the talk where you talked about trying to like small word models. But when you take into account the reward, it's like Lucy saying like I'm taking into account my policy value. I want to have a good dynamic subject to policy. The value function inherently has transition. So when you said you had a zero-side transition in this new setting, like you're making some assumption about transition or some other thing that allow you to do the transfer.
Right. So when we're doing the transfer, if we get like a new reward function, we assume the reward function is presented to us in English, and we just translate it into Python using an LLM. If we don't have any reward function, but there's just new stuff in the world, then we start with our old world model, even though we know it's wrong, and we let the agent kind of explore, do things, and it will collect new data, which shows that our old world model was bad, and therefore the code needs to be edited, debugged.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much for the talk.
Thank you.